Hello and welcome. This is Alchemist X, and today I'm not talking about Taga. Instead, I'm going to be talking about Honkai Star Rail. But just real quick, I made a community post about the new units. Azami is a debuffer, and she's very expensive because she's a normal limited unit. And then Louis is a memento unit, it's a little more economical. So I don't recommend Azami for newer players because she's very, very specialized for raiding. And I think getting the things like the damage dealers, type coverage is a bigger priority. Louis, on the other hand, I would definitely recommend if you need a boost for your water, especially if you're invested in water missile. Just as a memento unit, it's fairly economical, and the banner is quite good. So anyway, the main event today is Star Rail, and we're talking about it from the perspective of an Alchemist Code player, right? Because if you just want general Star Rail content, you don't have to look very far. It's as far as content creators go, a lot of established content creators are covering it. A lot of people are probably trying to make their entry point into it, and so if you want to know how anything works, battle systems, light cones, character tiers, gacha, that's going to be everywhere, all over YouTube. So what I want to talk about is, as an Alchemist Code player, would I recommend this game to other people who, you know, either it's their Alchemist Code is their main gacha or their favorite game or whatever. And I think that really depends because they have a bit in common. There's also a few things that are different, both in the gameplay mechanics and sort of the resource management. So I wanted to split how I talk about it into two sections. So either from the perspective of people who have never played Genshin before, and then for people that do also play Genshin and are familiar with that. So there'll be timestamps in the video, in the description as always. So skip to whichever one makes the most sense for you. And then after both of those, I'm just going to talk about some thoughts and concerns I have about like the future of Star Rail that is just a function of how its system works, concerns that I don't have for Genshin. So first and foremost, let's get into talking about Star Rail from the perspective of people who have never played Genshin before, or any Hoyo game before, too. We'll include Honkai 3rd in that. Okay, so from the perspective of someone who loves Alchemist Code, has never played a Hoyo game before, first and foremost, there is a lot to get caught up on, because I highly recommend not going into the game blind, at least with how like the gacha system works, how the core gameplay loop works, with how, because we all know you spend your energy to do stuff. That's a universal element to mobile games. But it's pretty specific insofar as how raising characters versus ascending them, which is sort of like enlightenment, versus leveling up their talents, which is not really like leveling up skills at all. And everything you do requires different materials. And a lot of that stuff is going to be very, very scarce at the beginning of the game. So that's why I recommend not going in blind, because it could really hinder your progression to spread yourself too thin. I think in Alchemist Code, you can get away with a lot of horizontal investment depending on how you structure your teams. Whereas in Star Rail, I would highly recommend more vertical investment, as in trying to raise a core group as much as you can first, and then only specialize after you've got a more abundant source of the resources used to raise characters. So that's like character level materials, I'm just going to call them mementos, the light cones. They have their own XP items, the items used to level up skills, talents, etc. The pacing will feel very, very different. I think it might take a little bit longer than it takes in Alchemist Code to get to the point where you can just acquire a new character and then just immediately get them at least close to the rest of your other characters. And speaking of, the pacing of acquiring characters is also going to be something that's very, very different. So I would not let Alchemist Code set your expectations for how that's going to go. Because, for example, like say that banner in Alchemist Code where you were guaranteed one limited unit among a limited pool, and if you got really lucky and you got like 3 5-stars in one pull and you get 3 limited units at the same time, like you are never going to see that in a Hoyo game. Honestly, like if you get 1 5-star like every 75 pulls, that's kind of your average. Hopefully you're not more unlucky than that. It's a matter of quality versus quantity, though, because while you won't see 5 stars nearly as often, pretty much everyone is going to be viable. Like, the disparity between the units is going to be way, way smaller. Like, there's, insofar as I can tell from both Genshin and Star Rail, with only a couple of exceptions, there's almost no bad 5-star units. Like, Genshin has one notoriously bad 5-star, kind of recently, Dea. But other than that, it's pretty much all good. The normal pool units are pretty good too, although they can actually be harder to get than the limited units. So the way that I look at it is that every new limited unit you get is like getting one of those 65k 5-step unlimited units. So you have to save for that. So to get the most out of your Primo Gems, the concept of saving for a really, really long time and waiting for that one unit that's going to help you out the most, or just that you like, and that's how I think you'll get the most value out of it. But as long as you can get past all of those hurdles, then I can definitely recommend it. It's pretty fun to play. I've encountered a few walls, either by like character account progression like needs to increase before you can move on, or sudden difficulty spike, but it wasn't anything that couldn't be quickly remedied with just gathering some materials and leveling people up, leveling up their memento things. I'm expecting the main game to not be too bad, and then the real difficulty to show up in the end game content, of which there's a couple of things. So yeah, I think that if you really like that tactical combat, you should give it a try and see if it works for you. And if not, then all you did was waste a little bit of time and some temporary hard drive space, I guess. Okay, let's move on to the next part. So, as a Genshin player, which I've been playing Genshin for the entirety of its existence, I enjoy it quite a bit. It's certainly one of my favorite games. It's not without its flaws, but I like it more than I dislike it. Star Rail, it's nice to be able to jump in and have a lot of the knowledge gained from Genshin just immediately translate over. Everything like gacha systems, how the different domains work, character raising. It's not 100%, but it's pretty close in many of its aspects. And then it's just a matter of the difference of the battle systems that really sets them apart. One, because Genshin is very dynamic, whereas Star Rail is not. And then there's the matter of Star Rail has, just by its very nature, going to have much harsher stat gating than it's going to be in Genshin. So, for example, I have characters that, well, for me, most enemies are going to be level 90. And the game does have damage scaling relative to characters' levels. So if you're significantly lower level than the enemies you're fighting, you'll do less damage. It's not huge, though. Like, you can be okay. Like, I have perfectly functional characters that are 80 that sometimes fight level 90 to 100 enemies, and it's all right. And sometimes I have support characters that are like level 70 because they don't need to have that high of stats, because they only need to show up for a second on the battlefield, do whatever it is that they do, whether that's elemental application or applying a buff, and then they just go right back into the pocket. They don't get hurt, and it's totally fine. That is not something you're going to be able to do in Star Rail. So you're going to need to commit more to the characters that you use. So there's going to be certain characters, like there's one character that I kind of like and dislike at the same time, Asta, because Asta with her elemental burst is able to boost the speed of the team, and sometimes that is the difference between life and death, just because more turns is more damage / more shields, etc. And she's great when providing her attack buff and potentially breaking enemies' shields that are weak to fire. But other times it feels like she's really not doing a whole lot aside from that, and so I'm feeling like the DPS cost of that, it feels very expensive. Like, I've had the feeling occasionally in Genshin where I'm just not covering as many bases as I'd like to at the same time, but it's a much more rare thing. Whereas in Star Rail, it feels a lot more common to just not have as many like elemental coverages or role coverages as you would like to have. Like one example is that the main character's second job that you unlock, I absolutely love it. It's nice to have a tank with a provoke. It's great, you know, kind of similar to things that I've done in Alchemist Code with like tanking kind of the equivalent of covering. But on the downside, the main character in that job is really, really slow. And so it's very painful to have like somebody who can taunt, but they don't get to act until after the enemies are acting, which is when the taunt would have been really, really useful. But I'll talk more about my speed and my concerns about that in the final section of this video. The main thing I think is that if you're coming from Genshin, I would not expect a Genshin ×2. Like, you're not getting into another Genshin by playing Star Rail. Like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of similarities in design philosophy. You know, there's a certain Hoyo touch, and it definitely has the Hoyo touch. But there's something about Genshin, you know, even if some of it's taken from Breath of the Wild and some of it's taken from other games, there's something that feels very unique about Genshin. It's like the combination of all those things. The elemental system is probably what really gets me. I love the fact that it's not just elemental rock, paper, scissors, that you get these reactions and they're kind of just independent of strength versus weakness. It's just these elements do these things, whether that's making explosions with fire and lightning or chain freezing enemies by constantly applying water and ice on them. It really feels like you are interacting with elemental magic as opposed to just doing different types of damage that affect modifiers in different ways. And that is something that Star Rail just definitely does not have. So if like Genshin, if like the things that you like about Genshin are the exploration, the field of just exploring this massive world and then interacting with elemental systems in this really fluid, dynamic way, then you're not going to find that in Star Rail. But on the plus side, I think that Star Rail is going to be less demanding of you and less demanding of your time for a couple of reasons. One, you especially when you first get to a new region in Genshin, you can explore for a ton of time and just be this giant time sink. That's not really going to be the case. And then also, Star Rail has an auto battle function, which is that just wouldn't work in Genshin. That just doesn't really make sense for the gameplay style. So for the more grindy aspects of Star Rail, at least you can potentially auto battle once you've got a team comp that properly works. And I think that's a pretty big plus side, especially it being more phone friendly too. So really, whether I recommend it or not, as a Genshin player, is going to be just how much do you like the Hoyo character design, storytelling, lore, etc. Because if you love it, then I think you'll like Star Rail, even if you don't love the combat in the same way. Okay, with that, I'm going to go on to the final section, just talking about the potential concerns I have. So, what are my main concerns with Star Rail? Well, being a turn-based game, I think that it's going to be more vulnerable to power creep. I, generally speaking, avoid turn-based mobile games. I mean, I guess I avoid most mobile games in general. It's just mostly Alchemist Code and Genshin, which I don't actually play on mobile. Other than that, whenever it's just your basic, you know, like I think of like Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, or there was another one I tried for like 2 seconds, but I don't even remember what it's called. But usually the experience in most of the cases, it's exactly the same, where you play for a while, it's kind of fun, maybe it's simple and efficient, or maybe it's got something interesting to it, but eventually you hit a wall, and the solution to that wall is pulling on the gacha. That, or you have to grind for like a million years. I think Alchemist Code has done a really, really good job of avoiding that just by being really generous and then having units get really, really niche. And Genshin has done the same thing. Just instead of characters getting progressively stronger, they just do different things. They have certain synergies with other units. So that way you can just go for whoever you like. That's why I use my favorite character in Genshin. He's not considered top tier by any means. He's considered just kind of decent. But decent is good enough when you have the right team comp. That's just not going to be as viable in Star Rail. Like, there's just going to be less room for creativity, and you won't be able to run at a challenge just head on and try to overcome it with just pure skill or pure tenacity. There's going to be this just this minimum stat point that you've got to hit. And if their solution to that is just having characters that just have a higher floor in their stats, especially if that stat is speed, then that's definitely a concern that I've got, because I don't think that's good for people's enjoyment. I don't think that's good for the health of a game, because you don't want to be seen as being pay to win. But otherwise, that's about it. I don't really have much else to complain about. I mean, I've sunk a bunch of time into the game. I've enjoyed the majority of the time that I've spent playing the game. There's been a couple of points where either the discrepancy between account level and continuing the next main story seemed kind of high, or just very sudden difficulty spikes, or the game not doing a great job of communicating what elements they want you to use, like having the recommended elements be one thing, but then having really annoying enemies that weren't listed with their break elements. But that stuff's all pretty minor at the end of the day. It's still a game I've sunk a ton of time into since its release, and whether I would recommend it, it really depends on how you look at the battle system. If you look at that battle system and you say, I don't like turn-based systems, then yeah, I don't think you'll enjoy Star Rail. Even if you really like the story, even if you really like the characters, I think that would just wear you down too quickly. If you're anywhere from like neutral to liking it, then I would absolutely recommend it. Especially if you're somebody who's a little bit strapped for time and you find yourself with your phone wanting something to play on it, I can recommend it that way, in a way I would never recommend anyone to play Genshin on their phone. So yeah, that's all I've really got to say about Star Rail for now. I'm not exactly sure if I want to keep covering it, or if I do, in exactly what way. It might be something I just check in on every once in a while. I did just pull my favorite character, which is Welt, today, and that made me pretty happy. Not only is my first imaginary character, but he's also my first Nihility role. But overall, I'm curious to know, for those of you that also play Taga, if you were also starting Star Rail, what all of you think of it. So, I guess we're not really talking about banners, but if you are pulling on Star Rail, I wish you good luck, and I will see you all next time.